Welcome to Dark Whispers. When I first stepped into the sprawling ridgelines of the Appalachian Mountains, I came searching for stories. Real encounters whisper across generations, scattered through cold towns, abandoned hollows, forgotten trails, and mist-drenched valleys. I expected folklore, exaggerations, drunk uncle campfire tales. Instead, I found people who spoke with trembling voices, who looked over their shoulders even in daylight, who insisted their stories were not legends but warnings. And each of them pointed me toward one truth. Something old still moves through Appalachia, and it watches us far more than we watch it. My journey began in a town so small it barely had a name anymore. Just a rusted sign, a shuttered gas station, and a diner whose neon flickered like a heartbeat on its last breath. Locals called it Old Briar Hollow, though the official maps erased it years ago. I sat in that diner with my recorder and notebook, expecting maybe one story, maybe two. But within an hour, 3 different people whispered about the same encounter, an event that happened deep in the mountain pass known as Bootlegger's Rift. The first storyteller was an elderly woman named Marla, her hands shaking around a chipped coffee mug. "It ain't a ghost," she told me. "It ain't an animal. It ain't anything you can shoot or pray away or reason with." Her voice cracked. "It's a presence, like the mountain itself woke up and decided to follow you." Another man, a trucker who introduced himself only as Dale, sat next to her and nodded. "I seen it once," he muttered. 15 years ago. Thought I imagined it, but it left prints. And the prints weren't human. The more they spoke, the colder that tiny diner felt. Bootlegger's Rift, they explained, was an old smuggler route that snaked between steep cliff walls, a place where headlights never seemed bright enough, and where CB radios went silent no matter how new the equipment. Drivers avoided it after sundown. Hunters refused to cross it even in daylight. And hikers, those who ignored the warnings, didn't always come out the other side. According to the locals, it began with a pair of cousins who disappeared in the mid-1990s. They were amateur urban explorers chasing the thrill of the unfamiliar. The only thing search teams found was their tent, collapsed, slashed open, the stakes ripped from the ground as if by hurricane winds. There were no tracks leading away, no signs of a struggle, no blood, nothing. Just a torn tent and the lingering smell of wet stone. Then came the audio recordings. A retired ranger named Gregory handed me a cassette tape. Its label faded, its plastic warped by age. "You listen to that," he said, "and you'll understand why I quit the Forest Service." When I played it later that night in my motel room, I expected static, maybe distant wildlife. Instead, I heard the frantic breathing of one of the missing cousins, followed by a low, resonant groaning. Not human, not animal, but something ancient and hollow, like the sound of a cave inhaling. Gregory told me, that sound, it wasn't coming from one place. It echoed inside the recorder like it was moving around him. All of these testimonies pointed toward what locals call the Hollow One, a figure that was never seen directly but always sensed, its presence pressing against the skin, freezing breath, and twisting the shadows into unnatural shapes. As the morning sun crept across the diner's windows, more townsfolk gathered. Some shared fragments of their encounters. Others simply listened, unwilling to speak aloud what they had endured. But the most disturbing detail came from a quiet, soft-spoken girl named Lacey, no older than 15. She told me she didn't believe the stories, until the night she and her father drove through Bootlegger's Rift after a late trip home from a hospital visit. She said at first it was just fog, thick, heavy, laying low on the road. But then the fog moved, not like clouds shifting, not like mist drifting. It curled upward, like fingers rising from the pavement. And before long, the world outside the headlights warped. Trees bending slightly, shadows stretching too far, the road seeming to pulse beneath them. Her father told her to keep her eyes forward, but she didn't, and she saw it. A tall shape standing exactly in the center of the road, featureless, unmoving, yet somehow staring straight into her. She blinked, and it was suddenly closer. She blinked again, and it was at the hood of the car. Her father slammed the gas, but the truck barely crawled forward, like something heavy pressed against it. Lacey said she remembered crying, shaking, praying. Then the pressure vanished. The truck lurched forward, and the fog lifted like a curtain. When they reached the edge of the rift, the truck's engine died, and her father refused to speak for the rest of the night. That was the moment I realized my documentary wasn't just a collection of eerie campfire tales. It was a map, each story a marker pointing to something lurking within the mountains, something that had been there long before the miners, long before the settlers, long before any human footsteps touched those ridges. I had come for stories, but Appalachia had given me warnings, and the deeper I traveled, the more I understood. Bootlegger's Rift was only the beginning. I left Old Briar Hollow with my head full of warnings, and my recorder full of voices that trembled more than the wind outside. But I wasn't just collecting stories. I was following a trail. Every account of the hollow one pointed south, toward a deeper, older stretch of Appalachia, a place locals called Black Timber Gorge, though most people preferred not to call it anything at all. The drive itself felt like entering another century. The paved roads thinned, the cell signal dissolved, and the forest grew so dense the sky became a narrow slit of gray above me. Fog gathered in the gullies, moving as if it had its own pulse. Even with the car heater humming, a coldness seeped into the cabin. The kind of cold that didn't come from weather, but from presence. Before entering the gorge, I stopped at the last settlement for miles, a cluster of decaying wooden houses hugging a creek swollen with icy rain. People didn't stare at me out of curiosity. They stared at me the way one might look at a man walking willingly toward a wildfire. A man named Russell, lean, gray-bearded, wearing a patched canvas jacket, flagged me down at the old general store. "You go into Black Timber?" he asked. "Just for research," I answered. He shook his head slowly. "That ain't research in there. That's trespassing." Despite his warning, he eventually agreed to talk after I offered to buy him a warm meal at the store's tiny diner counter. Once he sat, and once he steadied his hands long enough to wrap them around a mug of coffee, he gave me the story that shaped the rest of my journey. "It was 3 years back," he said. "My nephew, Carter, kid loved the outdoors. Thought he was invincible because he'd camped everywhere else. So one weekend, he decides he's going to do an overnighter in Black Timber. Just him, his dog Jesse, and a damn GoPro." Russell paused, swallowing hard. "We found the campsite. Found the dog, too." "What happened?" I asked quietly. "The dog came limping out of the tree lean after we called for hours. Tail between her legs. Ears flat. Wouldn't bark for months." "And your nephew?" Russell stared into his coffee as if the answer were hiding at the bottom. "Only thing we found," he said, "was his tent. Pitched perfectly. Zipper half open. Inside the sleeping bag, still warm, like he'd just stepped out. But no footprints leaving the camp. None coming in. Nothing. Just silence." He finally looked up at me, and on the GoPro, his voice cracked. There were 12 minutes of footage before it cut out. 12 minutes of him whispering that something was watching him, not around him, not behind him. He tapped his chest, but over him. When I asked if I could see the footage, he refused. Not angrily, not protectively, fearfully, as though showing it might pull something closer. Even so, he gave me directions into the gorge. "You'll know when you reach the line," he said. "Every animal goes quiet there, like the whole world holds its breath." The entrance to Black Timber Gorge wasn't marked on any map. No signs, no trailhead, just a narrow path between two stone outcroppings shaped by time, or by something else, something intentional. As soon as I stepped through them, the air thickened. The forest grew darker. Even though it was barely afternoon, my boots sank into damp earth, so soft it felt almost warm. At about a quarter mile in, I heard something, a rhythmic tapping. Soft, measured, like knuckles brushing against bark. But every time I turned toward the sound, it shifted behind me. I pulled out my recorder. Documentary log. Day 2. Entering Black Timber Gorge. Unnatural silence confirmed. No birds, no insects. Ambient tapping persists. My voice sounded small in that vast stillness. Then I saw it. A row of trees bent unnaturally forward, boughs arcing as if something enormous had swept them aside. The bark along each trunk was stripped clean at shoulder height, but not with claw marks, No. These were smooth, precise scrapes, as if carved by stone or bone. I moved closer. That was when the wind shifted and carried with it a faint, unmistakable scent. Wet stone, the same smell the locals said lingered in Bootlegger's Rift after the cousins vanished. Something connected these places. Something moving. I continued deeper. My flashlight beam caught glimmers of white against a tree trunk. Thin strands, almost like spider silk, but stretched vertically in parallel lines, vibrating faintly. When I touched one, it snapped soundlessly, leaving a cold residue on my finger. And then movement, not from the ground, from above. I froze as a shadow passed over me, drifting across the canopy like the silhouette of something tall and thin, stepping between the treetops without disturbing a single branch. The air temperature dropped instantly. My breath fogged. I didn't run. Not yet. I kept recording. Something is overhead. No visible form. No sound of movement. Trees not reacting. Shadow inconsistent with light direction. A soft whisper rippled through the branches. Not leaves. Not wind. A voice. Low. Hollow. Like the echo of someone speaking inside a cave. 3 words. Don't look up. Every instinct screamed at me to obey. But the human mind is traitorous in fear. I jerked my head upward. Nothing. Just darkness between branches. And then a shape flickered. Tall. Too tall. Limbs elongated. Stretching not with muscle but with shadow. No face. Only an impression of depth where a face should be. Something about it felt impossibly ancient. Impossibly wrong. A pulse of pressure hit my skull, and my ears rang violently. That was the moment my recorder shut off. I don't remember running. I only remember stumbling out of the gorge hours later, collapsing beside my car, lungs burning, clothes covered in damp soil, as if I crawled half the way. But worst of all, when I checked the recorder, the final 40 seconds had been overwritten, not with silence, with breathing. But it wasn't mine. It was too deep, too slow, too deliberate. And it stopped exactly when I stopped the recording. Something had been listening. Something had followed. And Black Timber Gorge was only the second place to warn me. I slept in my car that night outside Black Timber Gorge, though slept is a generous word. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that impossible silhouette drifting above the tree line, unnatural, elongated, bending the darkness around it. I kept the interior lights on, the recorder next to me, and the engine running just in case I needed to flee. By dawn, the forest looked normal again. Birds had returned. Frost steamed off the grass like breath, but I felt watched, even from the safety of the car. The gorge wasn't done with me. It had allowed me to leave, and that realization alone left my stomach hollow. My next destination was Red Creek, a narrow mountain town etched along an old mining road. It was the third place locals had mentioned when describing the thing that watches. Some said Red Creek had its own encounter. Others said Red Creek was where everything started. The drive there was steep, winding, and lined with skeletal pines. The mountains formed walls on both sides, as if funneling visitors into one inevitable path. The sky was a dull iron gray, the kind that promised rain but never delivered it. When I arrived, the town seemed frozen in a half-remembered past, wooden porches sagging under their own weight, chimneys leaning like tired old men, windows so dusty they reflected nothing. A lone convenience store stood near the entrance, Harlan's Market. The neon signs buzzed weakly. Inside, a middle-aged woman with freckles and a tired expression asked what brought me to Red Creek. Research, I said again, documenting Appalachian encounters. She winced. You mean the Whispering Line? I paused. Whispering Line? She nodded slowly, then gestured toward the forest ridge beyond the town. That's where you'll find it. But don't go alone. Folks say the mountain talks out there. I asked if she'd ever heard it herself. No, she whispered, because I listened to warnings. Before heading to the ridge, I interviewed several residents, though interview is too formal a word. It was more like coaxing details from people who feared saying too much. Most shook their heads and walked away. One elderly man shut his door the moment I mentioned encounter. Another muttered a prayer under his breath. But eventually I found someone willing to talk. Her name was Evelyn, late 70s, walking stick, eyes sharp despite her trembling hands. She invited me to her porch and told me her story with a clarity that unnerved me more than any shaking voice ever could. It was 1964, she said. I was 16. My brother and I used to hike the ridge north of Red Creek. Folks said there was an old surveyor path up there. We didn't know we were walking straight toward the line. Line? I asked. You'll understand when you see it. She described hearing whispering long, before she saw where it came from, murmurs that threaded between the trees like threads pulled tight. Not voices exactly, but something shaped like speech. When she and her brother reached the clearing, they found a straight row of trees, dozens of them, split along the trunks as if torn by a blade of wind. The splits were perfectly even, running the same direction, the wood inside pale and pulsing faintly as if it had warmth. I thought it was lightning damage, she said, until one of the splits closed, right in front of us, like the tree was healing. Her brother approached one of the trees despite her warnings. When he touched the split bark, Evelyn heard a whisper, so close it felt like someone leaned into her ear. Turn around. Her brother didn't turn. He pressed harder, curious. The tree shuddered. The split widened. Something black and thin slipped out, like a shadow trying to birth itself into sunlight. Evelyn grabbed her brother and ran, dragging him through briars, branches tearing at their clothes. It was only when they reached town that they realized the skin on her brother's palm had blistered, as if he'd touched a burning stove. The blister was shaped like an elongated hand, a hand far too long to be human. When she finished her story, Evelyn tapped her cane twice on the porch. The line isn't natural. It's where the mountain warns you it's awake. I headed toward the ridge in late afternoon, following the old surveyor path she described. The trail wound upward, the forest tightened like a throat around me. Every so often I heard it, the faintest brush of whispered air, like someone speaking behind a closed door. My recorder captured the sound, but playback revealed only a low hum. As the trail leveled out, I reached a stretch where the trees thinned. And there it was, the line. Dozens of trees stood in a perfect row, too perfect to be shaped by chance. Each trunk bore a long, narrow split running vertically from root to branch. The exposed wood inside was pale, almost luminous in the dim underbrush. And the whispering, it wasn't wind. It wasn't insects. It was coming from the splits. I moved closer. The temperature dropped sharply. My breath clouded. The whispering grew clearer. Not words yet, but rhythmic patterns, as though several voices were speaking at once behind a thin wall. Then one of the splits moved. Not the tree. The split itself. The two halves of torn bark flexed inward, as if something pressed from within. I stepped back. The tree shuddered. The split widened a fraction of an inch. A thin shadow gathered inside the opening, so dark it absorbed the light around it. The whispering shifted into coherence. You're not supposed to be here. The voice came from all the trees at once. My legs locked. Every instinct screamed to run, but my body went rigid with cold terror. The shadows inside the splits deepened. Branches above me trembled, not in wind, but in anticipation. A second whisper. It follows you. My throat tightened. What does? I whispered back before thinking. The trees went silent. Every single one. The forest held its breath. Then a third whisper, so close it brushed the back of my neck. Turn around. I didn't. I bolted, crashing through underbrush, slipping in wet leaves, barely able to breathe. The whispering swelled behind me like a rising tide. Something cracked a branch far too large for any animal. A shadow moved parallel to me through the trees, keeping pace. I didn't stop running until I reached my car in Red Creek. When I checked the recorder later, the forest whispers were faint, but one phrase rang clear at the very end, spoken in a deep, resonant tone. We see you. And I realized something horrifying. Every location I visited wasn't warning me about where not to go. They were telling me something was already following. After Red Creek, I should have left the mountains entirely. Any rational person would have. The whispering line had made something disturbingly clear. Whatever presence the locals feared wasn't tied to a single place. It wasn't a legend rooted in one hollow or one gully. It moved. It followed. And now it had taken an interest in me. But fear and curiosity are siblings in the world of documentary work. One pushes you back. The other pulls you deeper. And I knew the story wasn't complete. Not yet. If I left now, I'd only spend the rest of my life wondering what I'd run from. So I drove east toward a place several locals mentioned with a mixture of dread and pity, Briar's Crossing. They didn't talk about an encounter there. They talked about loss. Briar's Crossing wasn't a town anymore. It was a scattering of trailers and decaying cabins strung across a narrow valley, most abandoned, all sinking into earth softened by decades of unbroken rain. Only a handful of families remained. My map didn't even show the place. But as I drove down the winding gravel road that led into the valley, I saw a simple sign nailed to a dying cedar tree. Briar's Crossing, leave before the dark. Underneath, in smaller letters someone had carved by hand. This isn't a warning. It's a mercy. My stomach tightened. I arrived around dusk, the worst possible time, but I didn't have a choice. The sun was already bleeding behind the mountains, and by the time I reached the first cluster of homes, darkness had begun settling like ash. An old man sat on a sagging porch, rocking gently on a chair that creaked with every shift of his weight. His face was gaunt, his eyes watery but sharp. He watched me approach without speaking, as though waiting to see whether I'd turn back. I'm documenting Appalachian encounters. I told him. I heard Briar's Crossing. You heard wrong, he interrupted. We don't have encounters here. The silence stretched, cold and heavy. We have disappearances. He motioned for me to sit. His name was Hale. He'd lived in Briar's Crossing his entire life. And he was the last living person who had witnessed what the valley called the night the lights went out. It happened in 1998. The valley had already begun emptying out. Jobs gone, mines closed, roads washed out by storms. But people still clung to their homes, their land. Then one November night, every single light in Briar's Crossing blinked out at once. Not from a storm, not from a blown transformer. The power grid simply died. A group of neighbors went out to investigate, walking from house to house with lanterns and flashlights. Hale was among them. He told me the night was unusually quiet, so silent he could hear the blood in his ears. As they reached the far end of the valley, near the old sawmill, they found a house with its front door open. Inside, everything was normal. Warm meal half served. Radio playing static. But the family, mother, father, 2 kids, were gone. No sign of struggle. No sign of departure. Just absence. Before they could process it, one of the lanterns flickered. Hale said at that moment, every person in the group heard the same sound. A single, slow exhale coming from everywhere and nowhere. Then the flashlights dimmed. The lanterns gutted. One by one, their lights died until everyone stood in total darkness. You ever heard darkness? Hale asked me. I didn't understand. You will, he said quietly. He described how something moved through that darkness. Not footsteps, not breathing, but a shifting pressure, the sensation of a massive presence passing inches from them without touching their skin. Someone screamed. Someone ran. Hale didn't see anything. He fell to the floor and covered his head, whispering prayers, certain he would feel claws or hands or something worse close around him. But nothing touched him. When the lights returned, just as suddenly as they had vanished, 3 members of the search group were gone, never found, never heard from again. But the strangest detail was the one Hale almost didn't tell me. When the power came back, he whispered, every light bulb in every house glowed red, like they were filled with blood. He leaned closer, and inside each house the smell of wet stone. My skin crawled. That same scent had lingered in Bootlegger's Rift. It filled Black Timber Gorge. It threaded through Red Creek's whispering line. This presence wasn't isolated. It was everywhere. Why didn't you leave the valley after that night? I asked. He gave a broken smile. Where would I go that it wouldn't follow? Hale offered me a place to stay for the night, insisting the roads were too dangerous after dark. Part of me wanted to refuse. The rational side. But the thought of driving back through winding mountain roads while something stalked the treetops was worse. So I stayed. His cabin smelled like cedar and old wood. He lit kerosene lamps instead of electric lights. Safer, he muttered. Electric draws them. I didn't ask what them meant. Hours passed quietly. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the siding. The mountains groaned with the shifting temperature. Hale fell asleep in his rocking chair. I sat at the small table, reviewing my notes by lantern light. That was when I heard it. A soft, muffled pop, like a dying bulb. The kerosene lamp flickered. Twice. Then the flame dimmed to a thread of blue. My breath froze. Not again. Not here. From outside the cabin, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving through gravel without breaking rhythm. They stopped directly beside the wall near where I sat. The lantern flickered again. Hale didn't wake. A whisper seeped through the cracks in the wall. Low, resonant, familiar. You left a line. The kerosene lamp went out. Total darkness swallowed the room. Hale inhaled sharply in his sleep. And from just behind me, close enough that I felt warm breath on my neck, we didn't. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I couldn't. The darkness shifted, pressing inward, as if something vast bent down to inspect me. The air thickened. My ears rang. A shape formed in the black, tall, thin, disproportionate, bending without sound. A long pause. Then the presence receded. The darkness lightened, and the kerosene flame sputtered back to life on its own. Hale jerked awake. Did you hear it? I nodded, barely able to speak. He exhaled, shoulders sagging. It knows you, he whispered. And that means it won't stop now. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, because for the first time since entering Appalachia, I knew the mountain wasn't just watching. It was choosing, and it had chosen me. When dawn finally broke over Briar's Crossing, it did so weakly, like sunlight strained through a veil. I stepped outside Hale's cabin with stiff limbs and an exhausted brain. The valley felt wrong in daylight. Too quiet, too watchful. Even the birds sounded strained, chirping in broken bursts as if unwilling to violate the heavy stillness. Hale stood beside me with a hand on his cane, staring at the ridge above his home. You're heading deeper, he said. Aren't you? I nodded. He didn't try to stop me. He simply asked, where to next? I told him. Saints Hollow Mine. It was the fourth location traced by every local who had mentioned encounters similar to mine. The mine had been shut down since the 1930s, after a collapse killed 19 workers. But its legend didn't come from tragedy. It came from what the surviving miners claimed they saw inside right before the walls came down. Something tall. Something moving through the tunnels without touching the ground. Something whispering to them from the rock. Hale flinched at the name. That place shouldn't exist, he muttered. They sealed it for a reason. But he still gave me directions. Because at this point, I think he understood something I was starting to accept. This wasn't a story I could turn away from. Not anymore. The mine sat at the end of a long, eroded dirt road miles from any surviving community. As I drove, the forest thickened, swallowing the path until it felt like I was descending into the throat of the mountain itself. My recorder sat on the seat beside me. Documentary log. Day 5. Approaching Saints Hollow Mine. Barometric pressure has dropped significantly. Air feels charged, similar to right before a thunderstorm. Half a mile from the mine entrance, my car radio crackled to life on its own. No station. Just static, rising and falling in uneven waves. It synced with my heartbeat until I shut the radio off entirely. But the static didn't stop. It was coming through the car speakers, even when the radio was dead. Something was near. I parked and continued on foot. The mine entrance appeared through the trees like the jaw of some massive creature. Wooden beams rotted, rails rusted to orange skeletons, the mouth yawning into darkness thick as ink. A heavy metal gate had once sealed the entrance, but hung twisted and half-ripped from its hinges. Not broken by time. Something had pulled it open. My breath misted in the air, despite it being early fall. I clicked on my flashlight, the beam trembling more from my nerves than from any breeze. Inside, the mine walls pressed close. Narrow, damp, The smell of iron and old earth filled my lungs. The deeper I went, the colder it grew, unnaturally cold, as if descending into a freezer carved from stone. My recorder picked up faint echoes before I heard them myself. Soft, rhythmic knocks, like someone tapping on the walls with a long nail. 3 taps. Silence. 3 taps again. Miners once used tapping codes to communicate during tunnel collapses. But these taps were spaced too far apart to be human. I said into the recorder, possible structural noises, pattern too regular to be natural shifts. I knew I was lying to myself. The passage opened into a larger chamber, supported by rotted timbers. Old mining equipment lay scattered, rusted tools, collapsed carts, helmets with cracked lamps. In the center of the chamber stood something that froze my blood, a long vertical scrape carved into the wall. 6 feet tall, smooth, perfectly symmetrical, just like the trees on the whispering line in Red Creek. As I approached, my flashlight flickered, died. Darkness swallowed everything. I fumbled with the switch, panicking when I heard it. A slow, dragging inhale, not from ahead, not from behind, from above. Light snapped back on, and the chamber was empty, but in the dust at my feet, new footprints had appeared. Not boot prints, not animal prints. Long, narrow impressions shaped like stretched hands, fingers too elongated to bend naturally. They formed a pattern leading deeper into the mine, and every instinct in me screamed follow. But I didn't move. Not yet. I listened, and that's when the whispers began. First one, then another, then dozens. Not from ahead, not from behind, from inside the walls. They spoke in unison, layered, overlapping voices, rising and falling like breath. You're late. You shouldn't have come alone. It remembers you. My skin crawled. My pulse hammered. Remembers me? I whispered without meaning to. The voices stilled. Then a single, hollow voice, echoing as if from the deepest part of the earth, answered. You were seen in the gorge. My legs almost buckled. Black timber gorge. The shadow above the trees. I swallowed hard. What is it? I asked the air, barely audible. No answer. Only silence. Then very softly, close your eyes. I didn't. I couldn't. Behind me, something creaked, wood bending under enormous weight. I turned the flashlight and saw one of the support beams bowing, cracking inward. Something was pressing against it from the other side. The beam snapped. The far wall split open, not like a collapse, but like two of us peeling apart. A fissure widened, revealing a depth so black it seemed to absorb sound. A shape stepped forward. Tall, thin, limbs too long, joints too high, shadow clinging to it like skin stretched tight over emptiness. No features, just an indentation of a face where a face should be, its head tilted toward me. I froze. A long, narrow hand reached out, not touching me, but hovering inches from my chest. My recorder hissed with static. The air grew heavy, pressing on my ribs. My vision blurred. Then footsteps. Human ones. Behind me. Run! A voice screamed. It was Hale. I didn't question how he'd gotten there. I didn't look back at the figure. I sprinted toward the entrance, feet scraping through dust, lungs burning. The whisper swelled behind me, urgent, angry, gathering like a rising wind. The exit flickered ahead, a thin beam of daylight. I burst into the open, collapsing onto gravel, while Hale dragged me farther down the path. When I finally looked back, the mine entrance was still, quiet, as if nothing had stirred within. Hale panted heavily, gripping my arm. You went too deep, he said. When you go deep, it comes close. And when it comes close, he didn't finish. Because we both heard it then, from inside the mine. A single whisper carried on cold air, not done. Hale's face drained of color. It marked you, he said. Saints Hollow marked you. And I knew he was right. Because even after we left, even after the mine vanished behind the trees, the feeling clung to me. Something had reached out. Something had touched the world on my side of the darkness. Something had taken interest. And it wasn't finished. By the time I reached Sorrow Creek, I thought I had grown used to the Appalachian brand of fear. Stories whispered like confessions, warnings carved into memory, dread that lingered long after the telling. But Sorrow Creek wasn't like the other towns. It wasn't the hush in the air or the sound of the creek moving like a slow pulse through the valley. It wasn't even the abandoned houses leaning sideways, like they were listening for footsteps. It was a silence so thick it pressed against the eardrums, the kind that felt intentional, like the land was waiting for something to happen, or for something to return. Every town had its own legends, but Sorrow Creek had only one, the Lantern Man. Old miners spoke his name with the same dread they reserved for cave-ins and gas pockets. Parents told their children not to wander the creek after sunset, not because of animals or strangers or the steep cliffs, but because of him. And no matter who I spoke to, the story always began the same way. He walks with a lantern that never goes out. What changed were the details. Some said he was the ghost of a miner who died in the 1930 collapse. Others claimed he was something older, an omen, a lost soul that never belonged to the living. But the most unsettling version came from a retired mining supervisor named Harper. He lived in a cabin on the outskirts of town, surrounded by rusting shovels and forgotten rail carts. When I asked him about the Lantern Man, he didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared at the creek through his window, his jaw tightening. "You want the truth?" he finally said. "It ain't a ghost story. It's a warning most folks learn too late." He told me the encounter that changed Sorrow Creek forever. It began 19 years earlier, in late autumn, when the mine had officially shut down. Most of the workers had already moved away, but a handful stayed behind to pack their equipment and close the entrances. Among them was a man named Elias Durham, quiet, hard-working, always the last to clock out. Elias had lost his father in the same mines years before, and some said he kept working there to feel closer to him. One evening, Elias didn't show up at the bunkhouse after closing shift. The others assumed he was finishing paperwork or double-checking ventilation systems. But when 2 hours passed with no sign of him, Harper and another supervisor grabbed headlamps and followed the old shaft line into the mountain. It didn't take long to find Elias's lamp. It was lying on the ground near the timber supports, still lit but flickering sporadically. Harper said the flame looked strange, almost like it was being pulled sideways by an unseen current. But there was no wind, no movement, just a light leaning toward the darkness like it was trying to escape. They called Elias's name. No answer. They followed the shaft deeper. That's when they saw the glow. Not the flicker of a headlamp, not the reflection of safety lights, but a steady, pale orange circle illuminating the tunnel ahead. Harper swore it wasn't like any lantern he'd seen before. Too bright for oil, too controlled for flame, too cold for light. It cast a glow that didn't waver, didn't shift, didn't respond to movement. He described it as a dead light, a light that shouldn't exist. And beneath it, a shadow, tall, still, facing them. Harper froze. His partner turned and ran, stumbling through the narrow passage. Harper tried to call after him, but his throat locked. He said the shadow didn't move. It didn't breathe. It just watched. Then the lantern shifted, tilting slowly, like a head lowering in acknowledgement. The nearest support beam cracked. Harper bolted. He found his partner collapsed near the entrance, gasping for air, too terrified to speak. They got out of the tunnel, just minutes before a section of the shaft caved in. Rescue teams searched for Elias the next day, but the area was too unstable. The collapse sealed that entire section of the mine forever. Elias was never recovered. But the Lantern Man began appearing soon after. At first, it was just glimpses. Mineral workers heading home at dusk would see a pale glow drifting along the creek. Fishermen described a figure standing perfectly still in the fog, lantern held low, light shining unnaturally bright. Then the disappearances started. Dogs, livestock, eventually people. Harper's voice did not tremble, but his fingers tightened around the arm of his chair. "It don't matter if he's Elias' spirit or something darker," he said. "All that matters is this. If you see the lantern, you turn back. You don't call out. You don't get curious. You don't think it's someone who needs help." He leaned forward, Because if he turns a lantern toward you, it means you're already too close. Later that night, I walked to the edge of Sorrow Creek with my recorder, letting the sound of flowing water replace my thoughts. I didn't expect to find anything. I didn't want to, but the forest had grown unnaturally quiet. The wind stalled. The air thickened. Something flickered upstream, an orange glow, faint but unmistakably steady. It didn't flicker. It didn't waver. It didn't bend. A dead light. I didn't stay long enough to see the figure holding it. But as I hurried back toward the town, heart pounding, I felt eyes watching from the dark, calm, patient, old. And I realized something. Some warnings aren't meant to scare you. They're meant to keep you alive. Until this point, every encounter I documented in Appalachia had one thing in common. People ran from what they saw, or tried to. Their stories were fractured, desperate, shaken. But the next encounter wasn't about running. It was about listening, because something on the mountain had begun speaking first. Locals called it Whistler's Ridge, a place tucked between two ancient spines of forest, where the wind never seemed to follow the rules. Some days, the ridge was silent. Other days, it howled. But on the nights when the humidity clung to the skin and mist crawled low, the ridge gave off a different sound entirely. A voice, not wind, not birds, not echoes, a voice that knew your name. I first heard about it from a man named Jonah, an ex-forest surveyor, who now lived in a trailer miles from the nearest paved road. He greeted me with a wary look, the type of expression people wore only after they had seen something that changed them forever. He didn't want to talk at first. I didn't push him. But when he learned why I was there, why I was collecting encounters, his shoulders loosened and he poured me a mug of bitter coffee. "You ever hear a mountain speak?" he asked. I thought he meant the wind, the settling of old stone, the normal groans of an ancient range. But Jonah shook his head slowly. "No, I mean speech. Words, like a person standing right behind you." What he told me next stretched far beyond the usual fear of these mountains. His voice, usually steady, trembled in parts. It happened 3 years earlier, during a routine boundary survey. He and another worker, a young intern named Oliver, had hiked up Whistler's Ridge to mark old property lines. The trail was steep, but manageable. The sky was clear. Nothing felt out of the ordinary until they reached the midpoint of the ridge. There, the air shifted. Not colder, not warmer, just still, unnaturally still. Jonah noticed it first. "Do you hear that?" he asked. Oliver listened. "No wind," he said, shrugging. "It happens." But Jonah insisted something was wrong. Whistler's Ridge always had wind. Always. Moments later, that stillness broke. A sound drifted through the air, gentle at first, like the rustling of leaves. Then it sharpened, tightening into a whisper that slithered through the trees and wrapped around them both. Jonah froze. The whisper repeated, this time clearer. Jonah, his name, not shouted, not echoed, spoken softly, like someone leaning close to his ear. He spun around. No one was there. No figures. No shapes. Not even an animal. The woods behind him were empty. Oliver asked what was wrong, but Jonah only stared at the tree lean. He said he felt the whisper vibrate in his bones. Not just heard it, but felt it. They decided to continue their survey, but stick close together. They marked 2 more trees. Then the whisper came again. "Jonah, stay." It was louder now. Closer. Impossible. Oliver went pale. "You heard that, right?" he whispered. Jonah nodded. They didn't run, but they should have. The ridge began to shift. Not physically, but in atmosphere. The air thickened, pressing against their lungs like they had climbed 10,000 feet. The trees seemed taller. The shadows stretched deeper. The world felt subtly wrong, as if they had stepped into a place that didn't want them. Then something else happened. Something far worse. The mountain called out Oliver's name, and Oliver answered. He didn't mean to. His voice cracked out instinctively, a terrified what? As if responding to a living person calling from the woods. The moment the word left his mouth, Jonah grabbed him by the shoulder. "Don't talk to it," he warned. "Whatever it is, don't acknowledge it." But it was too late. A low rumble rolled beneath their feet, soft at first, then growing, like something moving deep within the mountain. Not an animal, not rockfall, a presence. Jonah described the sensation as being watched by something impossibly large, buried beneath the soil, studying them with ancient patience. He dragged Oliver toward the trail, but the forest fought back. The path they had taken minutes earlier looked wrong somehow, angled differently. The rise and fall of the land seemed unfamiliar. Mountains don't rearrange themselves, Jonah told me quietly. But that ridge, it tried. The whisper came a third time. Oliver, we hear you. Only, this time it wasn't singular. It was layered. Dozens of voices speaking as one. Low, deep resonant, echoing from every direction. Something massive shifted underground, cracking soil. Trees trembled. A pulse, yes, a pulse, rolled through the earth like the ridge itself had a heartbeat. That broke them. Jonah grabbed Oliver's wrist and ran, not down the path, but toward the sunlight peeking through the canopy. The whispers chased them, growing louder, faster, until they weren't whispers anymore. They became words. Clear, cold, calling. When Jonah and Oliver finally reached the base of the ridge, the air snapped back to normal. The wind returned suddenly, like it had been held back and released all at once. Birds began chirping. The mountain went still. They didn't stop running until they reached the work truck. Neither man ever returned to Whistler's Ridge. 2 months later, Oliver quit forestry altogether. He stopped answering Jonah's calls. He moved across the state. But before he left, he told Jonah one final thing. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I still hear it whisper my name. Jonah's eyes darkened as he finished his story. Mountains aren't just rock, he said. Not here, not in Appalachia. There's something inside them, something that listens. And if it knows your name, you don't go back. When I finally visited Whistler's Ridge myself, just for a few minutes, I didn't hear whispers, but the silence was heavy, too heavy, and for a moment, I felt a presence beneath my feet, patient, ancient, awake, listening. Some places in Appalachia look harmless at first glance. Small clearings, abandoned trails, quiet valleys. But there is one place, hidden deep in the hills of southern West Virginia, that looks unsettling even before you understand why. A place locals describe with one word. A void. Not dangerous. Not haunted. Just a void. They call it the Briar Maze, though the name doesn't appear on any map. It's a natural thicket. Acres of thorn-dense brush, tangled undergrowth, and narrow, winding animal paths that twist and split in directions that make no sense. People who wander inside come out scratched, bleeding, confused, or occasionally they don't come out at all. This is the encounter that convinced even seasoned hunters to stay away from the maze. It came from a man named Russ, a former game tracker who spent most of his life navigating the Appalachian backwoods. He was the kind of person who didn't scare easily. Bears, cougars, night travel, none of it rattled him. But the Briar Maze changed him. When I met him, he looked exhausted, like someone who hadn't slept a full night in years. He invited me onto his back porch and stared out at the woods the entire time he spoke, as if making sure the tree line wasn't hiding something. It's not the briars, he said. It's what's inside them. His story began 6 years earlier, when he was hired to find a missing hiker, a young college student named Mara, who disappeared while doing field research. Her last known location was near the maze. Search teams combed the perimeter, but refused to enter more than a few yards. Too dense. Too confusing. Too many blind turns. Russ went alone. He told me the first sign something was wrong appeared almost immediately. The air inside the maze felt heavier, stale, like the oxygen was thinning. Sound didn't travel normally. Leaves rustled without wind, and branches snapped somewhere behind him, though nothing moved. He could hear birds outside the thicket, but not a single sound from within. 20 minutes in, he found clothing, Mara's jacket, snagged high on a branch. Too high for her to have placed it there herself. The sleeves were shredded, not cut, like something with long fingers had pulled threads apart one by one. He also found footprints. Not normal ones. The heel impressions were deeper than the toe marks, suggesting something tall, something that stepped down with weight disproportionate to its stride. The tracks didn't resemble human prints at all, but they followed the path Mara had taken. He kept moving deeper, following those strange tracks and occasional scrap of torn fabric. The maze seemed to tighten around him, the briars curving inward in unnatural arches. More than once he had to crouch to squeeze under bent branches that looked deliberately shaped, as if the maze itself had grown around something tall enough to push aside. He was about to turn back when he heard it, breathing. Not the short, panicked gasps of a lost hiker, not even the huff of an animal. This breathing was low, rhythmic, and disturbingly close, just beyond the next bend. "Mara," he whispered, knowing even then it was foolish. The breathing stopped instantly. Then something stood up. Russ couldn't see it clearly. The briars blocked most of the view, but he saw enough. A silhouette that rose far too tall to be human. Thin, elongated, shoulders that sloped like broken branches. It didn't move toward him, didn't flee, didn't react. It simply watched. Russ backed away slowly, not daring to take his eyes off the shape. But the maze seemed to shift behind him. Paths he'd taken minutes earlier now forked in odd angles. The briars leaned differently. He felt trapped. He forced himself down a narrow passage, one that scraped his skin raw, and crawled under a low, thorn-laced archway. When he emerged on the other side, he felt a presence behind him, not close enough to touch, just close enough to know it was following. He didn't turn around. The paths twisted endlessly. Sometimes he saw the silhouette again, always distant, always still, always watching. It didn't chase. It didn't breathe anymore. It just mirrored his route, appearing at random gaps between branches, tall enough that his head always vanished into shadow. Then, at last, sunlight. He crawled through a final tangle of thorns and tumbled into an open clearing. The silhouette did not follow, but it stood at the edge, framed by the briars, too tall for its head to fit under the archway he had just escaped through. It didn't step closer. It didn't speak. It didn't tilt its head. It only watched him with a stillness that felt older than the forest. Russ ran. He alerted search crews immediately. They never found Mara, but they did find something near the maze's entrance, her boots placed neatly side by side, pointing inward, as if she had stepped out of them and walked barefoot into the thicket. And around the boots, in the dust, were footprints. Not Mara's, not Russ's. Footprints that were long, narrow, deeply pressed, just like the ones Russ had followed. That night, Russ returned to his cabin. He sat on his porch, just like he did with me, and he saw something move at the tree line. Something tall, something watching. He sold the house 3 months later. As Russ finished his story, I asked a question that had been sitting heavy in my mind. What do you think it wanted? He stared at the woods for a long time before answering. It doesn't hunt, he said. It doesn't chase. His voice dropped to a whisper. It just watches, waiting for the one who steps too close. I didn't enter the briar maze. I didn't even approach it. But when I drove away from that town, every rustle in the woods felt like a warning. And in the rear-view mirror, for one impossible moment, I thought I saw a tall silhouette standing perfectly still between the trees, watching. Some Appalachia stories feel like folklore. Some feel like nightmares. But a rare few feel like sins, things whispered only in the quietest moments, when the lights are dim and the air feels heavy. Things people won't admit they believe. Even though they do. This encounter came from a town so isolated, I almost didn't find it on satellite maps. Locals called it Hollow's Mercy, though most surrounding counties referred to it differently. The place with the dark church. When I arrived, it was less a town and more a scatter of houses leaning together for warmth. The forest pressed tight from all sides, swallowing any sense of distance. People here walk with their shoulders raised, eyes always drifting toward one spot. A narrow gravel road curving into the woods, leading to a place they refuse to mention by name. The church. When I asked about it in the general store, the owner refused to answer. When I asked an older woman on her porch, she slammed her door. But eventually, a man in his late 60s, thin as a fence post, with trembling hands, stopped me on the road. He didn't give me his name. He didn't need to. He said one sentence, voice soaked in dread. "Whatever you hear up there, don't answer it." Then he pointed toward the abandoned road and walked away. The church sat deep in the hills, hidden behind curtains of pine. At first glance, it wasn't frightening, just an old, rotting structure with collapsed gutters and boarded windows. But the deeper I looked, the stranger it felt. The doors weren't fully boarded shut. The ground around it wasn't overgrown like the rest of the forest, and the air felt thick like whispering breath against the skin. Inside, the church smelled like wet stone and old wood. Dust motes floated through cracks of dying sunlight. Pews were lined in perfect rows, too perfect for a place abandoned for decades. Cobwebs brushed my shoulders. The altar stood slanted, its cloth torn and stained. I was about to turn back when I noticed scratches on the pew nearest the aisle. Deep, uneven, almost frantic. Words. "Let U.S. in." I knelt down, tracing the grooves with my fingers. There were more carvings beneath it, names, dates, fragments of sentences carved by hands that pressed until they bled. Things like, "They sing below. We can hear them at night. Do not look back. They know our faces." And one last message, carved so deep the wood had splintered. "Do not pray." Before I could process any of it, a sound echoed from beneath the church. A soft, slow hum. Not machinery. Not wind. A voice. Then another joined it. And another. And another. A chorus building beneath my feet. I froze, listening. Low. Rhythmic. Chant-like. But the language, if it was a language, felt wrong. The syllables twisted strangely, rolling over each other, forming sound that vibrated in my chest. I stepped backward. The humming stopped instantly. The silence felt alive, leaning forward, waiting. Then, someone whispered my name. Not from the stairs. Not from outside. But from underneath the floorboards. I stumbled back, pulse exploding. The whisper came again, clearer. "Come down." The voice wasn't familiar, yet it spoke like it had known me for years. I backed toward the door, but the shadows in the corners shifted with me. I swear I saw movement between the pews, figures standing up from seats that should have been empty, shapes leaning forward slowly, obscured by darkness. I didn't look directly. I didn't want to know. The floor creaked behind me. Something was climbing the stairs from the basement. I bolted for the entrance. But as I grabbed the door, a sound rose behind me. A screeching chorus of whispers, dozens of voices overlapping into a frantic storm of words I couldn't decipher. The chanting swelled, pounding against the walls, shaking dust from the rafters. Something heavy hit the underside of the floorboards. Something else dragged its fingers along the pews. A cold breath grazed the back of my neck. I didn't turn around. I ran down the forest path, branches whipping my face, gravel skidding under my feet. The whispers followed me, or maybe they were in my head. The air behind me felt charged, hungry, reaching. Only when I reached the first house at the edge of town did the sound stop. A woman opened her door and stared at me with hollow eyes. "You heard them," she said. I didn't answer. She pointed toward the church road with a trembling finger. "They pray in the dark," she whispered, "and they listen when we pray back. That's why we stopped going. That's why the church died." I asked her what was beneath the building. Her lips tightened. "No one knows. It's been locked since before my grandparents were born. But if you speak near it, it speaks back." She closed the door without another word. That night, as I checked into my motel 3 counties away, something strange happened. When I lay down to sleep, the room went still. And just as my eyes closed, I heard a single whisper, soft, almost gentle, "Come back." But it didn't come from the motel room. It came from underneath me, from the floor, from the dark. The night Sam found the others in that abandoned ranger cabin. Something in the mountains shifted, as if the land itself had been waiting for all 8 stories to collide in one final echo. Rain hammered the metal roof. Lightning slashed through the sky, and the darkness outside pressed in like something alive. The group huddled around the dim lantern. Sam, Lily, Cole, Hannah, the brothers from Blue Hollow, and the old trucker who had followed the strange lights on Route 9. All strangers, yet all tied to the same shadow that had hunted them across Appalachia. The thing outside dragged its claws across the wooden siding. Slow, testing, listening. Sam felt the cold crawling up the back of his neck. "It's followed us," he whispered. "The same one. All of us saw it." "No," Lily said, shaking. "We all saw different things." The trucker leaned forward. "Or maybe it shows itself differently to each person. Old folks used to say there's a presence in these mountains older than the tribes, older than people. They called it the echoer, a shape that becomes whatever you fear most." The wind died. Absolute silence. Then 3 booming knocks on the door. No one moved. The lantern flickered, shadows stretching across the walls like long skeletal fingers. Cole reached for the door bolt, but Hannah snatched his arm. "Don't open it. It mimics voices. It mimics faces." Her lips trembled. "It mimicked my mother." As if hearing her, the thing outside tapped again. Softer, and then a perfect imitation of Hannah's mother's voice came. "Sweetheart, open up. It's cold out here." Hannah's breath shattered into a sob. Sam grabbed a piece of broken table leg and stepped back from the door. "We waited out. Dawn's only a few hours." The echoer began circling the cabin. With each step, its form changed, shifting silhouettes sliding under crack beneath the door. One moment tall, thin, and crooked. The next, hunched and dragging, like a feral thing on all fours. The temperature dropped until their breath fogged the air. Lightning flashed. A face appeared at the window. No, every face. The creature's skin rippled like liquid, morphing to the people each of them had feared, lost, or run from. Then it spoke in a warbling, layered voice. "You came together. You brought the stories. Now you belong to me." The lantern died. The room fell into a blackness, so complete it felt thick, suffocating. Something scraped across the floorboards. Someone screamed, short and choked off. A thud, then silence. Sam fumbled for the lantern, shaking hands trying to spark the flint. Click, click, click. Light returned in a weak orange glow. The room was empty. Everyone was gone. Only Sam remained, pressed against the far wall, shaking uncontrollably. The door was still bolted from the inside, windows unbroken. It was impossible. There was nowhere for them to go, nowhere to be dragged, except, Sam saw it then, a new shadow on the opposite wall, one that didn't match his own. It moved when he didn't. Long arms, bent spine, a head too wide, limbs that ended in points instead of fingers. It leaned closer, stretching out the wall, like ink dripping from a torn page. Sam backed away, heart detonating in his chest. No, you can't have me." The shadow rose to its full, impossible height. "I already do." Darkness swallowed the lantern, and Sam's scream never left the cabin. At dawn, hikers found the door still bolted shut. Inside was nothing but dust, claw marks across the floor, and one sentence carved into the wall. Fresh, jagged, deep. The echoer remembers the ones who tell its stories. And deep in the forest, something moved between the trees, carrying 8 new voices inside it.